Chapter 9. One of the few advantages to being different was that she had been given private quarters, a luxury that was only afforded to the strongest and most aggressive of the older hunters. The unblooded slept on mats in a giant chamber. Noguchi thought of it as the pit, their every spare moment spent watching fights or participating in them. Most training ships only carried a dozen or so novices, but Shell housed up to 40 young males, making the pit an exercise in arrogant posturing. Naguchi sat on the edge of her makeshift bed and took off her boots, feeling wrung out and depressed, not wanting to think about what had happened in the dock. The small dark room that she called home was the only place she really felt at ease anymore, the few mementos from her past giving her some small measure of peace. A medkit, a few toiletries, an aging wave scanner. There was a photo of Creep tacked to one wall, the dog that had stayed with her on Ryushi after the colonists had left. Before she'd gone with the hunters, she sent a signal to the closest outpost, requesting a pickup. She wondered where the friendly mutt was now, if he'd ever been reunited with his previous owner. The thought made her feel like crying, and she looked away from the hard-copy picture, looked up at the mammoth crowned skull that dominated the room from its place over her bed. The queen that she and Broken Tusk had killed, together. It was her first trophy, and she'd kept it with her on Ryushi, spent long, silent hours gazing at it, dreaming of the spiritual trek that awaited her when the hunters finally came. She'd imagined living among a people that found enlightenment in pushing beyond their own physical limits, a race that found life and self-awareness in the honourable death of a parasitic breed. 2 years she'd waited, alone on the hot and barren world, except for Creep, and a few head of Rinth. She knew that one day they would appear, looking for their missing ship, and when that day came, she'd go with them, embarking on a journey unlike any other. That wasn't a happy thought either, not anymore. Naguchi leaned back on the hard cot and crossed her legs, trying to come up with something that didn't make her hurt. Past is over. Think of the future, not of what's already gone. It was a strong thought, a positive one, and it worked as long as she didn't remind herself that she relied on it constantly. Some days, it seemed to be all she had. Except for the hunt. The queen had been secured and was already producing eggs, which meant 2 days or less until the next one. It was going to be big, too. She'd gathered as much from the excited chatter of the novices on her way to her quarters. A big hunt was something to look forward to, and this one sounded as important as any she'd participated in since coming to live with the Oucher. Several well-respected hunters would rendezvous with Shell, leader and warrior alike, and the novices would finally be given their marks, which meant many of them would move on. Blooding, the etched mark of a leader on his student's forehead, was the sign that a teacher believed his trainee was trustworthy to hunt alone. She reached up and touched the jagged scar above the bridge of her nose, unable to stop herself from thinking about Broken Tusk. The Chunde was his Yautja name, but the curved tooth of his lower left mandible had been snapped off, and she still thought of him by the description. Many things would have been different if he'd lived. Maybe we'd still be hunting together. Not necessarily true. They'd been thrown together under unusual circumstances, to say the least. If they'd met somewhere, anywhere else, perhaps her skull would be a trophy on his wall now. She sighed, shaking her head. She didn't believe that Dachande had been a warrior of integrity and skill, and had respected her enough to blood her, his final act before dying. They saved each other multiple times on that endless, bloody night so long ago. And she'd been so impressed, so changed by the experience, that she'd chosen to join with his people, who were so unlike him. She no longer knew what she was going to do. There it was, the truth of it. Noguchi rolled over onto one side, pulling her knees up, feeling an ache deep in her gut. After a lifetime of carefully building up defences and learning how hurtful people could be, she'd rejected her own kind in favour of a race that she knew nothing about. In her steady climb up the Chigusa corporate ladder, she'd been called an ice queen, frigid, a robot. and on some level, the mean-spirited tags had been accurate. She didn't really like people. And so I gave up on them. For this. She couldn't discount the powerfully addictive thrill of the hunt, but she also couldn't keep telling herself that things were going to get better. She was tolerated, no more. No one had ever tried to teach her anything beyond the most basic of Yautja language, and she felt even more alone than when she'd been the sole human being on Ryushi. At least then, she'd had her dreams. Impulsively, she reached out to the wave scanner next to the bed and tapped it on. The obsolete hunk of machinery was set to a search pattern and started lisping out static as she lay back down, reaching out into the universe for a channel in use. For months upon months, she hadn't touched the scanner, not even sure why she dragged it along. It couldn't transmit far enough to bother with, and she didn't receive much better. But in the last few weeks, she'd been turning it on more and more. Sometimes, not often, she'd catch a word or two in English or Japanese, and that contact, insignificant as it was, soothed her. With the soft hiss of blankness washing through the tiny room, Noguchi closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to think about what had happened and what it meant. She'd been berated for saving the mission the first time, in the nest, and ignored for her efforts to trap the Queen once aboard. If one of the hunters had escaped the Queen's clutches, he would have commanded a new respect. Had it been a novice, he might even have been blooded. Not an human, though. Not some tiny, pale, alien female. Doesn't matter that I carried Ashande's mark, or the name he gave me. Doesn't matter that I joined the hunters with a trophy that most leaders don't even hope for. Quest emergency. Annie receiving. A young man's voice, barely audible through the blank spots and hissing static, whispered into the small room. Naguchi tensed, straining to make out the message. Pete, Landutani, Nemesis. Wayland Yutani, a name she hadn't thought of in years. The company. She caught the word repeat, clear as day, and then there was a sharp, crackling pop, and the soft voice was gone. There was no way to know how long the message had been out there before her scanner had picked it up. Maybe hours, maybe days. Maybe the sender had succumbed to his emergency and was already dead. Like me, she thought, and finally the tears came. Noguchi curled into herself and then let them fall, wondering where there was left for her to go. 6 hours after Ellis made contact with the outpost, a D-ship tracked them in and passed over enough fuel and air to last them to the surface. The fuel wasn't a problem, but D-ships weren't designed to lend air to anything as small as an ETT's shuttle. Lucky for them, the ship's pilot was clever enough to have adapted one of their locks with an aperture compression tunnel. 5 minutes after hooking up, the shuttle's filters were clean, the weaves revitalized, the air changing from stale and dead to amazingly sweet. Company air. In a just universe, it would smell like shit. Lara was piloting, Ellis was asleep again, and Jess was trying to come to terms with who they were following. He sat stiffly next to Lara, hands in his lap, the smouldering anger in his gut making it impossible to rest. A Wayland Yutani D-ship for a company survey outpost. Didn't it just fucking figure? At least they'd had those 6 hours to feel good, to feel grateful to whatever God had seen fit to spare them, yet again. It wasn't until the D-ship made contact that they found out. The channel jockey, a man named Windy, had neglected to mention Bunda's affiliation. In fact, the obviously nervous Mr. Windy hadn't given them much at all, beside coordinates and ETAs, and that worried Jess just as much as anything. It was a company planet, only a survey station, researchers and such, but still part of the same system that had so thoroughly screwed them. Before his well-deserved death, Pop had made it clear that Grigson, the exec in charge of volunteer MAX teams, had sent them in to 949 to get a log from one of the docked ships, the company trader, and that once the data was retrieved, it was up to Pop to get rid of everyone who knew that the trader had been the source of the alien outbreak. Grigson sent the orders, but there was no chance in hell he was acting on his own. No chance. They probably figure we're dead anyway, Lara said quietly. Jess smiled, just a little. After so much time stuck together, they seemed to be on the same wavelength. Yeah, he said. Except we're not, and I figure they probably sent a heads up to every post in this half of the Big Black, just in case. You heard how windy it was. Lara nodded slowly, keeping her tired gaze fixed on the nav screen. They were trail hooked to the D ship, nothing for her to do, but she was as by the book as they came. If even one number read was off, she'd be all over it. Right, she sighed. So, any ideas? Jess shrugged. See how it looks once we set down, I guess. I mean, we worked for them, and didn't know how fucked they were. Maybe it's just the same for this group. If we tell them what's happened, they might help us. Assuming we can get them to believe us, Lara said. He nodded. And assuming they haven't already sent word back to the suits. Of course they had, but he didn't need to tell her that. The security on Bunda was probably already getting orders to kill them. Except, why bother saving our asses out here if they just mean to off us on landing? The Max, maybe? It was an expensive piece of equipment. Except it would be just as easy to salvage that after their air ran out. Funny how complicated things got when one found out they weren't going to die after all. Jess, you think there was something on that log? Besides proof that it was the company's fuck-up? He snorted. Isn't that enough? Killing 400 of their own is plenty, you ask me. Lara finally looked away from the screen, frowning. Grigson wanted that download, and he wanted us dead, right? So, if Bunda already told the company that they found us, why wouldn't they just leave us out here to die? Unless they think maybe we hid the download, Jess finished. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the shuttle systems interrupted only by Ellis's occasional snore from the back. They could knock themselves out trying to guess what the company did or didn't want, what information had been exchanged about the remnants of their team, whether or not they were slated for torture, death, or a vacation. What it came down to was that they wouldn't know until they knew. We wait, Jess said finally, scruffing at the stubble on his chin. Wait and see what's what. We thank whoever's calling the shots for pulling us in, get Ellis to a med program, hit the showers, and just wait and see. Not the most comforting of answers, but it was the best he could do. Lara was together enough to handle herself, whatever came up. Ellis, on the other hand. Physically, he was a lot better, but Jess wasn't sure how he was doing otherwise. There was a vague look in his eyes now that wasn't there before his sacrificial ride in the Max, and sometimes he talked about the suit like it was more than a suit. Gonna have to watch out for him. The kid had saved his life, and tried to save Teep and Pulaski. Jess wasn't about to let anything happen to him. Looking at ETA 5 hours 20 minutes, Lara said. About 1100 on Bunda. In just before lunch. Jess tried to think of some clever comment to go with the news, but he was too wasted. He really should try to get a little more sleep. Except they were going to land in the middle of company in just a few hours. And that thought cinched a knot of rage in his belly. No way he could sleep. That they were basically unarmed, exhausted, and outnumbered didn't make a difference. If the biotechs on Bunda didn't know how fucked the company was, he was going to make sure they fully understood the situation. And if they did know, if they embraced the avarice and treachery of Weyland-Yutani with open arms, then they're going to be sorry they ever picked up our call. Real sorry. Jess sighed inwardly, wondering when he'd become such an optimist. Whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be up to him.